All right, so thanks everyone for joining our special seminar joined with Computational Neuroscience Journal Club today. It is my pleasure to introduce Andre. He's a professor in the Department of Physics and Cellular and Molecular Medicine at University of Ottawa. His research focuses on theoretical and computational neuroscience, stochastic dynamics, and nonlinear dynamics. So today he will tell us some of the related work about envelope phase dynamics in stochastic neural models with delayed interactions.
Right, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. Too bad I can't be there in person. I encourage you to ask questions as I go along. I'm going to try and pare down the stuff. I think I have a lot of stuff here, but they're kind of thematically related, and we don't need to go into details of all things, but I'm going to try and give you an idea of what we're talking about in these envelope phase dynamics and delayed interactions. So the outline of my talk is as follows. So brain rhythms are these oscillations in neural activity, and it turns out that they're not regular oscillations, but they have starts and stops, and for that reason they're called bursty. And the question is generally, what's the dynamical regime that underlies this kind of behavior? And I'm going to focus on something called quasi-cycles. Quasi-cycles is an idea that came out actually early on in population dynamics, where you don't have a limit cycle, but you have something else where you induce an oscillation using noise. So there'll be some talk of the statistics of these rhythms and approaches to characterize them. And this is work done mainly by my student, PhD student, Arthur Owanwe. This is predicated on having an idea what the circuit is in the first place, which is not always the case. You know, and in fact, it's rarely the case. And the second part, I'm just going to say a few words about a new method we came up with to infer the circuitry on which you could then apply the first part. And that's work done by my PhD student, Alexandre René, and this is co-supervised by Jacob Macke over in Tübingen. And the last part, I'm just going to say a few words about a new mechanism to produce these kinds of limit cycles out of chaos. And it involves when you have multiple areas that are connected through multiple delays. Okay, so let's get started with the brain rhythm context. Instead of, you can talk about population dynamics, the same general math would apply here, but we'll talk about brain rhythms. And by population dynamics, I mean like measles or other things, which are thought to also be noise-induced rhythms in population infections. So we have ongoing voltage fluctuations in neuron populations, and these are measured through electrodes, either local electrodes measuring local field potentials, or the electroencephalogram on the whole head. And they occur in different bands, like gamma rhythms and beta rhythms. And they play major roles in things like communication between brain areas, memory, attention, motor control. I should say this is circumstantial evidence. We don't quite know what they mean, but they seem to be implicated in all these things, because when they're not there, these things get disordered. And the statistics are particularly disordered in diseases like Parkinson's and epilepsy, schizophrenia, and autism. So that's the general background. And we know a lot of ways to get these rhythms. And the simplest way is if you have a population of excitatory cells. So there's two basic types of neurons. There's E cells and I cells, excitatory-inhibitory cells. And you can imagine that the I cells are connected to themselves, but also to the E cells, and the E cells connected to themselves, but also to the I cells. And each population receives input from the outside world, from some other part of the brain. There are mechanisms that involve only I cells. What I'm talking about today applies to that as well, but you have to throw in a delay to make the story consistent. So this mechanism is called ping, where you have these two interacting populations. And the basic idea is that the brain rhythm is an autonomous thing, like a limit cycle oscillation, right? You don't need external periodic forcing. And by and large, the modeling has been deterministic. So you show up, with a couple oscillators or something that will just give you, or a simple system in which you'll get a Hopf bifurcation and the system will oscillate, and that's it. But real rhythms are actually quite stochastic. And here's an example where you have data from a visual cortex of macaque, data from Zhang et al. Here. So on the top here is that you have the voltage from a recording electrode. And notice that this voltage goes up and down, okay? And there are epochs that look a little bit more oscillatory than others. And those epochs are highlighted in gray. And sometimes it's hard to tell just by looking at it. So you can do a Fourier transform to get the frequency content and plot that out over time. And you'll see that there are, for example, here there's a black bar. It means there's this yellow higher power in this range of frequencies during this gray epoch. Then it all kind of disappears again. Then there's another epoch here, another epoch here. And the frequency content changes from epoch to epoch. And the appearance of the epochs appears to be random, and the duration of them as well. So that's the real data. So there's a problem in trying to match deterministic models onto this kind of data. And you can try and get, chaotic dynamics or something that has some kind of intrinsic variability to it to reproduce this. But I'm going to go a simpler route with some noise. Okay. Now you can look at these rhythms. You'll see the power spectrum will have some peak in spite of the burstiness of the when these epochs occur. You can do a Fourier transform of the whole thing, and you'll still see a little bump around here, 50, 60 hertz, and people will say, aha, there's a gamma rhythm here. But it's quite noisy rhythm, and the phase is all over the place. This is the phase distribution. All right. The other thing you can try is to look at the duration of the bursts. You can calculate a histogram of the durations of the bursts. And you can do this in health and in various pathologies. And you see there's a maximum around 150, 100 or so milliseconds here, 120 milliseconds. And the frequency content is, around this value here. So you see the red is a very high point. So the frequency content and the burst duration have some kind of coupling. And so our task has been to give some theory for this. And what I draw your attention to is that you can try to model the fine detail of this, but you can also try to model when do these gray areas appear. And that's more a characteristic of the slow rhythm here. Like the slowly varying amplitude is going to be something that tells us about the bursting. And our goal was to say, well, what determines this bursts, how long they are, where they are, and so on.
In this data, André?
Yes?
In this data, the epochs, the gray regions, they have been picked by hand by the experimentalist, or?
I think they have some threshold on the color bar.
Oh, okay.
And then they do the spectrogram like this, and then they put some threshold on the power. So whenever you reach a warmer color, you start putting a black bar down. So there is an arbitrary element to where you put the gray bars. And there's various methods in the literature on how to do this exactly. None of it is exact. You pick one and you hope other people are going to do the same to get some kind of understanding. The one we're going to use is called the P episode method, but there's other ones out there in the literature.
Thank you.
Okay, so the rhythms appear as short epochs or bursts, and their occurrence and their duration appear like random variables with the mean burst duration that lies somewhere in this range, and deviations from healthy bursts are characteristic of pathology. One other aspect is that there's been kind of a fringe element in the literature that discusses gamma activity in particular as just being filtered noise generated by these recurrent excitatory-inhibitory networks. So to come back to this picture, you have an excitatory-inhibitory network, and there's these inputs can basically be just noise, and they're just filtering the noise. And that's compatible actually with some of these statistics that we're seeing here. And
Can I just ask a kind of basic question about the plot where you have phase versus frequency? Why would you expect the phase of one frequency to be related to another frequency? Just because it seems almost like meaningless to compare phases at different frequency, because the cycles having different periods. How can you be, if you're in phase at one point in time, you'd be out of phase at another? So I'm just trying to understand what's being plotted.
well, I mean, just from, if you pick your favorite waveform and you do Fourier analysis on it, you'll get characteristic amplitude distribution and phase distribution. And it's going to be highly ordered, right? If it's a periodic rhythm,
I see.
if it's a square wave or something. So the phases are you have to put the components with the right phases to build the original rhythm back up. So the fact that they're scrambled tells you that this is more compatible with noise. Okay. When you do the amplitude, you throw away the phase. So you're just looking at the modulus. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll probably just have to run some examples to remind myself.
Okay. And the bursts are thought to be important communication events. There's been some suggestion of that they're like communication packets, and so it's been suggested as an idea. So not only are they important to characterize what's going on in these spectrograms, but they actually might be little chunks of information. Okay, so what we did was to propose an envelope phase equations. Now, in the literature, often this is called an amplitude phase equation, but I'm calling it envelope phase just to really emphasize that it's the very slow aspect of the envelope of the rhythm that we're picking out. For those of you who know some time series analysis like Hilbert transforms, we're getting at the Hilbert amplitude, okay, the analytic signal amplitude, to characterize the burst durations and the burst frequency, and finding the dynamical regimes where burst statistics match experiments. We're going to look at theoretical expressions for the burst duration in terms of the parameters of the network. And interestingly, we can formulate this also as a first passage time problem for the envelope dynamics. In other words, if you look at as a slow envelope here, well, here the slow envelope is going up. So and then it's coming back down. So this would be, how long does it take if you start low to go to a high envelope part again up here, right? So this is going to be formulated as a first passage time problem. Okay, now the details of this model don't matter. I'm just going to throw them at you anyways. This is from, it's called the stochastic Wilson-Cohen model. Wilson-Cohen dates back to 1972 or so. And it's a mathematical description of that diagram I showed a bit earlier here, but there's no noise. So you have two activities, the proportion of E cells that are active at a given time and the proportion of I cells that are active at a given time. And they each decay exponentially, but they're also driven by the outside, by the inputs they receive through some firing function, F, which you can see as a sigmoid, okay, sigmoid response function. And S is going to be the input to the E cells. And the input to the E cells would be things coming from the I cells, things coming from themselves, and things coming from the outside. So you have self-coupling, coupling to the other population, and external. So this is the input to that. And the SI, you do the same thing. But then you get these other terms, which are called finite size fluctuations. And these are two Gaussian white noises, uncoupled. And in the limit of large population sizes, n, you can throw these terms away. The whole system just turns into the old deterministic dynamics. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is only a two-variable system. But you can show that this system over here reproduces well the property of a NE and NI size network. You can describe the mean activity with this network. But I'm going to be talking only about 2D systems. And there's going to be a complex conjugate eigenvalue from the linearization of this part, of the deterministic part. And that's going to be this over here. And we're going to make this quite small, meaning that it's an underdamped oscillator. It's still on the damp side. It's still, there's no, your real parts are negative. Nu is positive, by the way, here. So the real part is negative, but it's close to the Hopf. Okay, so it's a mildly damped oscillator. And you can do more analysis just around here. You can change the variables to these VEs and VIs, and then you get these two equations instead, VE and VI. You can linearize the thing, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to throw out everything and just keep the linear terms and see how far that gets us. And you'll have basically one linear equation here for VE coupled to VE and VI, and it's driven by its own noise. And the other one, the other population, is also coupled to itself and the other population and has its own noise as well. And from this, you can calculate things like the amplitude of the VE and VI ratio and the phase difference between these two. Once you've written down the voltages, you know, in this manner, okay, you can say, okay, the voltage is going to be a slow envelope times a cosine with a phase. And same thing, VI is going to be a slow envelope multiplied by cosine with a phase and a phase difference. And notice that the only difference between the amplitudes here is a factor alpha. So you take the amplitude of the ice, it's just alpha times the amplitude of the E's. And this is borne out some good approximation in the numerics, it turns out, for these kinds of problems. So the question is, how do you go from this system, which for those of you who know stochastic processes a bit more, this is a two-dimensional Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, okay? And how do you go to this description? So this was actually solved quite a while ago. It's called the Rayleigh, you get the Rayleigh dynamics. And, but we're doing it with the noise here. And what you get, and I'm not going to go through this, but these coefficients that are in the equations, A11, A12, and all that, they're functions of everything, all the parameters that you have in the problem. You change one parameter, you change the fixed point, all the other parameters change, but you have a handle on all the detail is in these coefficients. So, for example, the natural frequency of the problem is this, the eigenvalue is this, the real part, and they're a function of all the details of the problem. Okay. Now, the regime is the question. If you want asynchronous activity, you go to how do you get it? So we're going to talk about something called the transient synchrony regime. It's also another word for the asynchronous activity, but in the literature, it's often called this, transient synchrony. So we're near but below the onset of synchrony. And by synchrony here, it's a synchrony that's going to repeat. So it's going to be oscillatory synchrony. So we're below the Hopf bifurcation. And there's no deterministic limit cycle. You turn off the noise. So if there's one thing you should remember from this talk is I'm looking at systems where if there's no noise, there's nothing. There's just a fixed point. So you need the noise to kind of kick around the system, and you're going to get these oscillations that are stochastic. It's a noise-induced rhythm generated by the noise, and that noise is the synaptic input coming from other cells. And this appears to be the regime also for beta oscillations by the group by Raphael Bogatz at Oxford has been putting out some recent papers on this as well. Okay, so let's take a two-dimensional parameter space to locate ourselves here. So you have WEE, WII, these are self-coupling coefficients. And let's look at 4 distances from this red curve. This red curve is the Hopf boundary. So on this side, you would have high synchrony. You have a limit cycle, basically, okay? But it's not regular. Notice the amplitudes are fluctuating. Why? Because there's noise. So the noise perturbs the limit cycle. And if you do the spectrogram of this thing, the Fourier analysis, you'll get a nice big red bar that fluctuates a bit. But that does not look like the data, right? The data look like this, not a big red bar. It looks like patches, bursts. So on this side, you get something that looks more like the data. You get this burstiness of patterns. So you get these patches of synchrony, and the rhythms go up and down. Okay, so as a first observation is that the data seems to be compatible with an operating regime below the Hopf bifurcation with noise. And this has also been argued in another context for gamma oscillations by this group here a few years ago. Okay, so we're going to just move along closer and closer. And in fact, what we find is that, a sweet spot is around here. This is too close and this is too far. But this is only 2 parameters. There's a whole bunch of parameters. So you can spend the rest of your life just figuring out exactly what are the optimal regimes. We're not going to do that. So, but it's just to give you an idea that this is a good regime. Okay. Now,
I have a question.
Yes.
So synchrony, as defined in this talk, is about the existence of something that's close to a limit cycle oscillator.
Yes.
Right. And then in the burstiness regime from the previous slide, is that due entirely to the coefficient ZE of t?
Yes. Yes, precisely. So if we look at over here, ZE is the thing that's going up and down in front of the cosine. So that's the thing going up and down in front of the cosine here. And when it's high, this is red. And when it's low, it's blue. So you're right. That's the Z we're looking for.
Cool.
Okay, good, thanks. So there's a way to, so there are various ways to go from fast equations to slow equations. There are less methods to do this in the presence of noise. And I'm going to talk about one method that is actually by these authors up here, Roberts and Spanos. It's in this paper here. It was devised originally by Stratinovich, improved by Bogolyubov, Mitropolsky, and these guys did it more recently in more detail. So you have, once you plug these equations into your original fast system, you wind up with equations for these 2 variables. And there's a deterministic part and there's a stochastic part, right? These eta E's and eta I's, there are noise processes. They can be white noise, they can be psi E and psi I, or generally they can be whatever you want. And it turns out that, so you can rewrite this whole system generally as some deterministic flow plus some stochastic part in matrix form. And there's a procedure now to take this thing, which is kind of a nonlinear mixture of noises, and to approximate it by a Markov process. And that's what this method does. So you can turn that equation. Notice the previous one just has F plus G. Now we're going to turning it into M plus H. So this is a drift, deterministic drift, and this is a diffusion. And this is a Markov process. So, just Brownian motion. These terms are of order epsilon squared and epsilon, and you can think of epsilon as being the real part of lambda. So it's small. So you're in the underdamped regime. There's quite a lengthy calculation to get here. Not that bad, but a few pages of algebra to get to these coefficients. You can estimate them by taking the time average of this thing, and this is the expectation of F. That should be big G here, sorry. So, and then the expectation of the product of these 2, obviously this is a matrix, it's a Jacobian, and likewise H prime, you do a deterministic average and you do a stochastic average. You have to take the expectations over the noise. And you can solve for the coefficients of H, and then you can get H and M here. And what's the average? The average, you're going to average over the period of a deterministic cycle. I mean, that's a choice, and it turns out that it works pretty well. And this is the main result, where you have amplitude envelope phase equations via the stochastic averaging method. So dz dt is minus z plus d over z. Okay, so d is the noise. So you get some nonlinearity that's controlled by the noise level, and you have this Brownian motion here, and the phase is also 1 over ze times a separate Brownian motion. Now, this was done originally by Priscilla Greenwood and her colleagues using a theorem called, well, the Greenwood-Baxendale theorem. We did it using a different method, and the stochastic averaging method, and we also did it by keeping the whole parameterization of the stochastic process so that we can have a control of the parameters in terms of all the original parameters of the problem. So this amplitude phase description has all the coefficients in here. Nu is A11 plus A22, and those ones are like A11 is all this stuff. Okay, so you know where you are for your parameters. Now, it turns out that there's very few parameters left, right, from the original problem. There's these two meta parameters that show up, nu and d, and they're here. D is like a linear combination of the noises in the problem, and you have these deterministic parameters. And in fact, you can do Fokker-Planck analysis to calculate from this diffusion process. Well, it's a drift diffusion process. It's simple enough that you can just compute it. You can just compute P of Z by Fokker-Planck analysis, right? We're taking advantage of the fact that Z is not coupled to phi. Phi is coupled to Z, so that's a bit more problematic, but Z is on its own. So you can just compute P of Z, and P of Z just shows up as this one parameter, nu over d. So we call that R. So there's just one meta parameter that governs the whole thing. Of course, it's a function of everything else, but that R is the thing that controls, where the distribution of the envelope has a peak. Well, in fact, it controls the envelope distribution, which is this thing, which is a Rayleigh distribution. And you have this parameter R, and that's the parameter that I was varying here as you go from here to here to here to here. I'm just varying that parameter R. So you can go ahead and just vary this parameter R. You go from, if you're too far, you get this. If you're too close, you get lots of bursts and long bursts. And in between is this kind of sweet spot where you have the fast rhythm, which is V, and the slow rhythm is in black on top, okay? And this is the distribution of Z. The black is the numerics, and the red is the theory. Okay, so the theory that I just showed you. So theory is doing pretty well here to capture the distribution of the envelope, and in particular, where is the peak of the envelope? So you have large envelope, small envelope, and that's where you can put your cutoff in terms of your color code and say, above this value here is where I'm going to say I have a burst. Let me just show you that in particular. Okay, and the other thing we did is to say, well, what's the mean duration of a burst? Well, I can look at a blow up here, and the blue is the fast voltage rhythm. Black is this envelope dynamics that you have on top. And you notice the envelope fluctuations are quite rapid here. It is a Brownian motion driving this. We've done some extensions of this with Ornstein-Uhlenbeck driving instead of white noise driving. That makes things more complicated, but it'll smooth things out a bit more and look a bit more like the data. But for the time being, we can say, well, how long does a burst last? So you can set yourself some kind of threshold in red here, okay, and say, okay, how long does it take to go up and down? There's a way to do this. There's a better way to do this now, which we're working out now, because there was a recent paper that proposes a technique to do first passage times back to the same point, okay, which is not trivial. And we're developing this in more detail now. But for now, we can just approximate how long lasts a burst. So you can say, how long does it take to go from this point up to the typical maximum that you see in your distribution, and how long does it take to go back down? And we're just taking the simple addition of the two times, T1 plus T2. In reality, you'd have to convolve the two, distributions to get this, but we're just doing an approximation. And this is the time of a mean burst duration. And it's expressed in terms of these exponential integrals and the parameters of the problem. This coefficient R. So to go into detail here, so the red is a theory and the green is the experiment, is a numerical experiment. So as you go from far away to closer to closer to closer, you see that notice the scales are changing here, okay? So you're getting longer and longer bursts, and the theory is matching better and better as you're getting closer and closer. So you can have some handle using this theory to say, okay, my patient has this pathological oscillation. What do? I need to slow down the rate of bursting because it's too synchronous. Well, there's a variety of ways to do it. Some are probably better than others. We're trying to get our head around that now. But we can say, okay, maybe you could just change WEE, the self-excitation in the problem. And that's going to reduce you maybe from here down to here. You're going to slow down the bursts. So the mean burst duration is around 500 here. You can go down to 150 if you move the parameters this way. Okay.
Quick question.
Yep.
So, yeah, it seems like panel A, and on an absolute scale, the theory is actually pretty close to the numerical experiment, right? Compared to panel D. And I'm curious if, you're making the comparison based on the relative scale.
Absolutely, yeah. Because you do get these, so we're comparing it on a scale of what fits in a plot to be seen as a distribution. But you're right, the magnitude here in absolute terms is further off than here. In relative terms, it's better.
Okay, thank you.
Good point. Okay. You can get the distributions of frequencies to match more of the data in this sweet spot range as well. So this is what the data looks like. This is what we can get in this range. So they're similar. These ones are a bit higher because we're looking at the peak frequency rather than the mean frequencies, but you can get some, the theory can speak to the frequency content as well. Okay. So now what we did is we took one of these systems that we just talked about, which is on, let's say, the left or the right here, and we're coupling them together. And this is the game that a lot of people, and especially cognitive neuroscience, do with electrode recordings, implanted electrodes, electrocardiogram electrodes, so on and so forth. You have communication between different areas. So there's an oscillation in one area going on here using the mechanism I just described, and an oscillation in another area. And the question is, well, what happens when you couple them together? What happens to the bursting? What happens to the synchronization? And in particular, there's been some recent theories proposed to say, well, what are the, how do the bursts synchronize between the two? And is there one system leading the other that's sending bursts to the other one and the other one just follows? Or what's the phase lags between the system? These efforts, should I call them, are like scratching the surface because we don't quite know what's the information being exchanged. We can say, okay, area B and A are synchronized in amplitude, or but not in phase, or gamma in one area couples to beta in another area, and so there's a whole zoology of knowledge being mapped out here. I should mention it's also not the only way. It's like this quasi-cycle thing is not the only way to get rhythms. You can get other rhythms. You can have genuine stochastic limit cycles rather than quasi-cycles. So there's a few studies of that in literature. And I think Jonathan has a recent paper with Erntraud as well on a new method to get stochastic oscillations in such networks applied to Parkinson's, I think you did, right? In your PRX paper.
Right. Yeah.
So this is subset of possibilities. And okay, so we're going to talk about two networks that are coupled together with delays. Okay. So the question that people ask often is, how do they synchronize? Can you synchronize two areas in spite of the delays? Because that's observed under some conditions. So here's a delay of 1 millisecond between two areas. And you notice that these two oscillations are in phase. Okay, so these are in phase. So this would be the activity of the E cells on the left and on the right. So, you're looking at these guys and these guys, but we're plotting them, this guy in blue and this guy in red. Okay, so how are these two synchronized? So you see that they're well synchronized in this range of parameters, right? But if you change the delay by a small amount, then they can start to fall out of phase. Now, it's known from the theory of deterministic oscillators, Kuromoto oscillators or whatever, that you can get in-phase solutions, out-of-phase solutions, and anti-phase solutions. So in-phase and anti-phase are obvious. Out-of-phase is everything in between, okay? And there has to be a spontaneous symmetry breaking that gives you from in-phase to out-of-phase to get the out-of-phase. But what about rhythms that don't survive on their own? They need noise. So that's the theory that we're trying to cook up here, is that if you have noise-induced rhythms, can you do any of this? Can you describe the synchronization between areas? Because both rely on the noise to even exist in the first place. So this is what I'm going to talk about just for a few minutes here. So you can do the exact same procedure that I talked about. We have two coupled brain regions. And you have E11, E12, E21, E22, and there's one coupling delay. This is an extension of the stochastic averaging method to the case where there's a delay. And we shut our eyes and we did it. Okay, we didn't worry about whether this was legit or not. Okay, and in all the integrals, the delay is just there, and we just do the integrals with the delay, and that's it. And you wind up with this mess, which is an amplitude phase description for system 1 and an amplitude phase description for system 2. And they're obviously coupled to these functions M1 and M2, which are this down here. And the delay shows up a bit everywhere in here. And you have 4 stochastic processes here, 4 Brownian motions. Before we had 2 for one system, so now we have 4 for 2 systems. And you can do more analysis here and calculate a stochastic stability function for the problem. And you can't do much further analytically with this part. You have to run the numerical solutions through this function to estimate where they are. And just to give you an idea, as you increase the delay from 0 to 1 to 3, you're going to go from a distribution of phases that's unimodal to bimodal. And in fact, you're going to pick up these new differences in phase that are away from pi. They're out of phase, not anti-phase. And the stochastic stability function is going to pick up this as well. It's going to pick up this modulation by the noise and the delay. So you can have this picture. Go ahead.
Yeah, is it bimodal or is it just peaked at anti-phase? Was just wondering.
It's actually bimodal.
Yeah, it's bimodal.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not peaked at pi. It's 2 peaks around.
That's right.
Because these graphs, we think of them as periodic, right?
Yeah.
The graph. Okay.
So you can have, so in the coupled limit cycle case, you would have a change in phase as a function of the delay here. And you're going to go look at the deterministic case as black. You're going to go from in phase to out of phase. And there's a spontaneous symmetry breaking happening here. Okay, so the system will select this or that depending on the fluctuations in your numerics, or in the real system, you'll select the upper branch or the lower branch. But you have bistability here, right? And if you add noise to the problem, you kind of push further back this transition between the two. So where this out of phase, where the symmetry breaking happens, you push it away further because of the noise. In the case of quasi-cycles, well, you have in phase or out of phase. That's what the deterministic theory tells you. Because I mean, with no noise, you don't. Okay, so you have to imagine how you're actually estimating this, because they're not oscillating without noise. We're looking at the transients in each system, and you can look at the phase of the transients to get to these plots. But then you can add noise, and then you see the symmetry breaking happens now, as in the coupled limit cycle case. You get similar phenomenology. You get these out of phase states that they don't quite go to antiphase. If there's too much noise, you won't reach antiphase. And furthermore, an interesting point is that the more noise you put on, now you move the bifurcation backwards instead of forwards. Okay, from the quasi-cycle point of view.
I have a question. I mean, this is really interesting. The first case that the noise basically makes the stability more stable, as a function of this delay. Like the second panel, I would have expected that noise like destabilizes things sooner. So right, like in the first panel, it's as if noise makes green is more noise, right?
That's right. The noise is indeed stabilizing the zero phase state. That does happen in some bifurcations.
Yeah, and is there any intuition for that? That's really interesting.
I've looked at these over the last few decades. I don't have a clear picture in this case what's going on, but you'd have to figure out why the unimodal density stays unimodal longer before going bimodal, and sometimes it's just the properties of the nonlinearity itself and how you can smooth it in your head with noise, and you can see, oh yeah, it's not strong enough. The noise has kind of smoothed out the nonlinearity, and therefore you don't have enough nonlinearity yet to bifurcate. You need more, and or in this case, you need more delay. More delay brings in more instability. So that's one picture that I have sometimes that could work, is that the noise smooths things out and you don't have enough nonlinearity to cause the bifurcations. Okay.
Very cool. Thanks.
All right. So we looked at asymmetric cases, because all that was the fantasy world of symmetric networks, but you can look at asymmetric networks or heterogeneous networks, and now you get similar stories, but you get this symmetry breaking going on in the problem.
I just had another quick question. If you increase the delay to half the period, is it kind of now a mirror image? They'll come back together?
You could expect that for some bifurcation. We haven't seen that, because this is what, if you keep going past 6 here, it just keeps going. But I think the period is longer than this. We should check this out again. There might be something there. You might, because I know if you increase delays, if you make delays, you increase delays by a multiple of the period of the oscillation, you get some repetitions in some other systems. But those solutions don't necessarily have the same stability. You may pick up the same periodicity, but it might become unstable there and you won't see it anymore. So people have tried this with deterministic Hopf bifurcations and delay equations. You'd expect a solution to exist for tau, and tau plus a multiple of the period of the solution. And sometimes it works and sometimes it just becomes unstable. But good point. Okay, so I'm not going to go into much more detail about this, but stochastic averaging method produces envelope equations, and it's one-way coupling to lowest order. It accounts for many of the observed features in the data, the burstiness, the phase, the frequency content, and there seems to be an optimal region in parameter space for producing these stochastic oscillations. a mean first passage time analysis on the envelope, the 1D envelope dynamics. It gives you some fairly accurate description of the burst durations. And the burst duration approaches, as you approach the hot bifurcation, they get longer. So that's maybe a sign of pathology in some systems. So you want to move away back to get your burst statistics in the right range. And I'm collaborating with colleagues here and elsewhere who are actually doing surgery. And that's one of the things that they look for. They look to reduce the burst statistics in the right place using their deep brain stimulation electrodes. So you don't want them too frequent, and you don't want them too rare. You need to have some. And if they're not the right mixture, then the patient can't initiate movement. So implicitly, they've been fooling around with bursts for a while. They just, but the theory is catching up now, and hopefully will catch up more. And we've looked at quasi-cycles, with in extended networks and phase synchronization between brain areas. Could be, a good guide to therapeutic stimulation, and the theory can guide how to correct faulty statistics. But all this is predicated on, having EI networks in the first place. Is the model good? If you're looking at Parkinson's literature, or even the gamma rhythm literature, which is a bit simpler, I would say, EI is not necessarily the best picture. And in beta rhythms, it's certainly not the best picture. So, but there might be a good effective description. If you have like multiple nuclei together, the whole thing behaves a bit like an EI network effectively. And maybe if you can estimate a parameter of an effective EI network, you can get some understanding of what I've just talked about and some handle on the complexity of these bursts. And let me just say a few words about this. We've done some work on how to infer these models from a mesoscopic population using population spike trains. So the idea is the following. Let's say you have microscopic data from multicellular recordings, spike trains from many cells. And from these, you can just add them up and get some population response, okay? Now, it's very difficult if you have 3,000 cells. You don't want to cook up a model for 3,000 cells, but maybe you have a model for 2 populations, like the ones I just showed you. So from the microscopic data, you can construct a population response, and then you can look in the literature for a theory that links these mesoscopic level descriptions, such as Wilson-Cowan or spike response methods, in terms of the microscopic responses. And then you don't fit the microscopic theory, you fit this mesoscopic theory to the data. So you have, let's say, 10,000 cells, but you have a theory that has 2 variables for the population level descriptions. And you're going to fit the population level model to the microscopic data. Now, this is a machine learning approach, and you can use it as long as you can formulate a likelihood. Now, neurons, like many other biological systems, have plenty of ingredients to give you likelihoods. The probabilities are all over the place because there's noise. But if you don't have a likelihood, then you don't have anything really to work with. So you want a model that has some noise in it. And then you can fit this using your favorite algorithm for fitting likelihoods. And then you can include other phenomena like adaptation if the theory exists. Okay, so this is a picture of what I just said. So you have a microscopic model with excitation and inhibition, 2 polarities of responses, maybe adaptation. And there's something called escape noise, which is a formalism that says, given the voltage of the cell, what's the probability that I'm going to get a spike at any time? And you just plug an analytic function of that. That's called the escape noise formalism. It dates back to the 40s and 50s. And now from this, you can have some theoretical work that derives a mesoscopic model. And from this, you can simulate and produce population responses, all the microscopic detail. But then you can lump these together, like all the blue ones, lump them together into this, all the red ones into this. So then you have 2 variables. Then you can fit this 2 variable model using this data, these data here. Okay, so we've tried this, but we use a quite complicated model that had a lot of detail in it. Each neuron has, it's a generalized integrate and fire model. And I won't go into these details, but this is the escape noise at the bottom. It's basically like a modulated Poisson process. You can say, what's the rate of probability of firing a spike? It's an exponential that depends on the distance between your voltage and the threshold. But this model has a lot of stuff in it. It has like a threshold that goes up every time there's a firing. And this is the model by Thilo, Schalger, and Gerstner's group. It's called the Meso-GIF model. And you can write down a probability of observing a certain sequence of spikes. Just take that for granted. You can say, what's the probability that I observe the sequence of spikes from the model? And then I can write down a likelihood from this using binomial statistics. And that's the basic idea. And this is a thing that's going to be optimized using stochastic gradient descent. So in a nutshell, you can vary these inputs. If you're going to try this at home, you don't want to just have your favorite population of cells and just record from them. You want to perturb them away from their steady state attractors to get some idea of the timescales that are in the problem. So one way to do that is to drive it sinusoidally. So you drive it sinusoidally and you look at your population responses. You can apply white noise if you want here, whatever you want, but just get the system to move away from its comfort zone. And you can look at the population activities. And then you're going to fit the model. Let's say you're looking to fit this parameter, the coupling between I cells and E cells in the model. And this is the iterations of the algorithm. So you start somewhere, like any of these gray curves. This is an initial condition from a prior you've assumed. And this one goes off somewhere, not very useful. But most trajectories are kind of starting somewhere and they go off near this ground truth. The ground truth is the one you put in the model. Okay, so you have the model that you've designed by hand, you know what's in it. You generate data from it, and then you do the inverse. You use the data and you try to infer the model. So you try to infer the model using the data, and some inferences are completely wrong. A lot of them are right. And this is an example of what you can do. You can look at the inferred is the blue. The big splotches around them are the plus or minus 1 standard deviation. Okay. But look at the agreement of the blue, the orange, and the green. They're basically on top of each other here. There's some discrepancy. There's two theories, okay? There's one inferred, but there's actually two theories. There's one true, which is what you put in the original microscopic system. That's true micro. But then there's the theory that goes to the mesoscopic level using the micro, the true micro. So that's the real theory. And then there's the inferred. So all three can match pretty well. And we've studied this with heterogeneity, without heterogeneity. And you can try this even with the Pochon-Diesman model of a cortical column, where you have 36 free parameters, 4 populations, and you can also get fairly good reproduction of the weights. You're trying to estimate all the parameters in this model. There's 36 parameters. You need quite a bit of data, but you can do it. So the upshot is, to study birth statistics, you need a good EI model. But what if EI is not the right description? Well, you can try this and go and obtain the best model possible for the system you're studying. And then you can try to study the EI statistics, the birth statistics on this thing. But that's a lot of work. I haven't done that yet. We haven't done that yet. But maybe you can just work back for one EI model or 2 EI models like I just showed you with coupling delays, and then you can do the estimate on this. and then you can go and do your burst statistics. So you can infer the model. There's a way to infer the model from data. If it doesn't work, it's because, you know, the model is not the good model. It's just not, you don't have the right topology. You're missing a few pieces, and that's typically the case. Okay, so I think I will, so the challenge is here, you know, what if the model is incorrect or we have only partial information? If you're trying to do this online during an experiment or during surgery, you know, we're not there yet. And I was going to add one word that, you know, there's many brain areas, there's many delays, and I'm going to leave you with one image. There's a paradox. If you have a few delays, you know, you add complexity to your problem. You increase the entropy, you make the dynamical invariance, the Lyapunov exponents, more complicated. We know that already. But we know that continuous distributions of delays, if you have too many delays, things are simple. So somewhere in between, there has to be a maximum. There must be a non-monotonic dependence of complexity on the number of delays. And it turns out we've found some version of this using various models, but this is a biological model, so I'll just show this one, the Mackey glass, with multiple delays. So instead of having just one delay here, you have tau I, and you're summing over multiple delays, this whole feedback function. You know, one delay gives you chaos in this thing. It gives you limit cycles as well. But what if you have multiple delays? Well, here's 680, here's 700. These are the attractors, you know, projected in 2D, using the average delay as your other embedding delay. And 710, 800. You can reduce the complexity dramatically by adding more delays. And there's these weird bifurcations going on in the network as you increase delays. So it might be that the rhythms I've been talking about are actually multi-delayed systems, but you're operating them from the chaos side. And there's some regions here where you're really straddling between an oscillation and a chaotic orbit, a periodic orbit. You can do things like permutation entropies. You'll see at 700, boom, it falls. You can increase the number of delays in the problem, make the delays larger and larger, you can try this, you don't need 700 delays, you can change the parameters and get this earlier. You're 5, 15, 25, 40, and you get these really interesting bifurcation diagrams as a function of the number of delays. You get chaos, then you get these periodic windows. And I increase the number of delays even further, I get chaos and more periodic windows. And then after that, here you have a reverse period doubling sequence. You go from here, and then you get limit cycles. And the permutation entropy has these bumps whenever there's a chaotic window. So it might be that the rhythms we're seeing in the brain are actually caused by multiple areas talking to each other through multiple delays. And these are the limit cycles that we're talking about. And we don't know what these do with noise, but it's clear if you're in this regime, you can actually get things that start looking like the data as well. You get lots of fluctuations because you're straddling the chaos limit cycle boundary with the number of delays. So we call this complexity collapse.
Can I just ask, how reliable is a plot like this if you now selected different random numbers? Yeah, because each time, this is like every time you have 20 random numbers, you get something that looks almost exactly like this, or this is an average over them, or?
We don't have a good answer to that yet. Because we pick a number of random delays from the distribution. So the precise boundaries here are going to depend exactly on which delays you picked out of your distribution of delays.
Right.
You're
but you
quite
think
right.
the structure there is consistent?
Yes, but the gross features of the skeleton of the bifurcation diagram seem to be consistent.
Okay.
So you're getting these cascades, but now as a function of number of delays. And you'll go back to this regime where people say, okay, there's too many delays in the system. I'm just going to call it a distribution of delays, and I'm going to write down integral differential equations rather than discrete delays. But there is an intermediate regime that people haven't explored where you get all this transition back out of chaos. We call it complexity collapse. And I'm going to leave you with that. So we've quantified this with Lyapunov exponents as well, developing a method to calculate multiple Lyapunov exponents for multiple delay systems. And you can read that in the papers. So the number of active feedback loops may tune the regime between chaos and limit cycle. So you might get different brain states. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for such an interesting talk. So please feel free to ask questions if you have any.
Sounds good. Thanks for the questions during the talk. Oops, I'm gonna get rid of this.
I have one
more
question.
small one.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
Okay, back when you had the single oscillator and were pushing it to the Hopf bifurcation, do you think it produces criticality as you get closer and closer? You know, if you like looked at the durations of bursts and the overall amplitude, you can like assess it for critical statistics.
There's going to be some critical statistics here, but we don't know the exponents yet for the burst. We're actually working on that.
Okay.
Because this is way too simple compared to, like avalanche theory or avalanche stories where you have like multiple things and you have avalanches. That's the criticality you're thinking about, Paul? Yeah. So I presented this at a talk which was populated mainly at a conference that was populated mainly by criticality people. And that was the kind of question. They want to know, okay, can you get that? So what we're actually doing now is we're looking at this thing and looking at the critical properties of this process. And it has actually some power law behaviors for the spectrum we're finding out. So it's very possible that simple stuff like this, limit cycles with noise, the envelope part is going to have some properties of the seen in the criticality literature, and some not, I presume. Yeah.
So I assume you're going to get power laws because when you threshold the stochastic process and look at the bridges above threshold, you get the duration of the bridge that has a power law. And also the area below the bridge.
Right.
And so it's been argued in some papers that
the one you did one with Alain Destek, I think, right? You and Alain did one, I think, right, on looking at stochastic processes with the thresholding. With the
threshold, and you look, and you'll probably have that when you threshold your to look at the duration of the burst, because you're able to describe this amplitude by the stochastic process. Likely to have
so I expect some of these statistics to come out of these thresholding. We're actually doing the calculation analytically because you can do it with this thing, with the first passage time problem. And but we'll see. That hopefully will come out next year, and we have to tie it into your paper, Jonathan. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be compatible with what you and Alain did.
I had a question regarding the type of noise that you take. So if you started with the Wallace model, which is a reduction of the Markov a Markov chain, and so the noise is multiplicative, right? And
so which model are you talking about?
The first part of the talk, right here.
Yes.
So you have noise that is multiplicative, and I was wondering if you thought there was kind of a role of this multiplicative noise in your behavior, or if you have just additive noise, you would get the same.
Yes, so I did a jump here, first of all, that this is the Wallace model in which you indeed have multiplicative noise because the state variables are in here multiplying the psi. But if you can go to a more phenomenological description and just have this be constant diffusion coefficients, and that's what we did in this paper. Okay. So the bottom line is, number one, we did additive noise. We have another paper under review where we included the noise in the activities here, which means that the noise is going to be included in these F functions. And that leads to a description with additive and multiplicative noise. And it seems in that case that the multiplicative noise, the multiplicative noise is going to enhance this phenomena that we just saw, where it's actually going to push the system more towards the Hopf regime. That's what we found. And so the analytics bear this out. So that's all I can say so far. If you include synaptic noise in the functions here, you will get some extra effects. Actually, interestingly, you see the eigenvalue here get moved over into the right-hand side of the plane as a function of the noise level. You see it directly.
Okay.
If you take that into account.
That's really impressive.
All right. Do we have any more questions for André? Alrighty, I guess we will just wrap up here for today. I'd like to thank our speaker André again and everyone for participating. So we will skip next week because it's Thanksgiving, and we will have our very last talk on December the 9th. Hopefully to see you guys over there, and happy early Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks so much for your questions. It got me thinking about a few more things to do. And keep well.
Thank you, André.
Thank you, Jonathan and Paul in particular. Nice seeing you again.
Nice to
Good to
see
see
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.